And there we go. See, thanks, Dave. We are pleased to have with us tonight Phil Wheeler from the Rochester chapter of the NAACP. He has been doing these presentations to other groups, but tonight we are going to have him talking to us about the racial covenants in Olmsted County. These restrictive covenants were in place and are no longer legal, but there's a history and information on what still needs to be done with that. And then after that, we're going to talk a bit about the way that that covenants can still create problems for affordability for many people, and especially impacting communities of people of color and those that are economically stressed, perhaps. So we'll be talking about that, and then what we might be able to do to address some of the things that covenants are doing still in our area. So Phil, if you would introduce yourself a little bit more, and you can begin to talk about the project you're working on. Perhaps it would help, especially because I don't know who's going to be on Facebook or watching this in the recorded sessions later, if you could just describe briefly what exactly is a covenant and how it might differ or be similar to legislative or city requirements like zoning. So Phil, take it away. Thank you.
Okay. What covenants are and how they relate to other types of regulations, I think is covered in the presentation.
Okay, great. So good.
So my background is I'm the former planning director here from 1990 to 2013. I first learned about covenants back in grad school, which was, because I'm an old man, a long, long time ago. By the time I was in grad school, racial covenants had been declared illegal across the country. I was born a year after they were declared unenforceable by the Supreme Court. So the NAACP Education Committee has took this project on because of the concerns about the enduring impact of racial covenants and the fact that many people are not aware that we ever had them here in Olmsted County. So in addition to having a planning background, I also have an undergraduate degree in history, and I've been involved in racial justice issues for a long time. Chair of the board of the Diversity Council, for example, back in the 90s, and member of the NAACP for a very, very long time. So I think that covers it. I'll move on. Maybe. So I said the NAACP Education Committee is interested in this partly as the educational value of letting people know that the history of segregation includes places like Rochester and places like Pine Island and other places that had what are called sundown towns. So there were a number of ways for prejudice to be expressed up here. Even though they've been unenforceable, their impacts still endure, especially in older cities like Cleveland, for example, where the city is essentially the same size as it was in the 1930s, and the areas that had covenants back then still have covenants, or still have a segregated impact, segregated community. Another reason for looking at them is that there's this notion that there's a difference between legal segregation and de facto segregation, as if de facto segregation is accidental or expresses a market preference. But the covenants and the other things that reflected covenants were enforced by legal mechanisms. And so it's an arbitrary and false distinction. And so finally, white privilege entails learning about concrete examples such as covenants. We started this and found out that when we contacted property records and licensing at Olmsted County, that the city attorney's office had also asked for free access to the abstract files. And that was because they were starting the Just Deeds project. And the Just Deeds project discharges these covenants so that although they remain on the abstract, there's also a codicil that says that the owner renounces this covenant. So we are cooperating with the city by identifying them so that they can identify willing owners who want to expunge them, essentially. Want to distinguish between two forms of residential discrimination. They're not the only forms, but there are two of them. One is redlining, and that's the practice by lenders of denying conventional loans and mortgages in areas of the city. We are cooperating with the city. Denying. I'm getting an echo.
That was mine, and I just had to close out my another laptop. So sorry.
All right. Racial covenants are private agreements, part of a sales transaction, and they are intended to create exclusive, in quotes, neighborhoods. So both resulted in segregation, along with things like steering and block busting and so on. So more on redlining. The systematic redlining began in 1920 through the National Association of Real Estate Boards. And the criteria used to establish systematic redlining were also adopted by the Federal Housing Administration as part of the New Deal housing programs. And anything suggesting that neighborhoods were integrated or had minority residents was an indication to the Federal Housing Administration that those neighborhoods were unstable, and because they were unstable, they were bad risks for mortgage loans. Areas that had covenants received a higher rating, even after the Supreme Court ruling made them unenforceable. Here's the redlining map for Rochester from the mid-30s. It's covers as small an area as it does because Rochester in the mid-1930s had only somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people in it, and it was pretty dense. I mean, pretty small. And that's one reason why redlining has had less of an impact on our community than probably than covenants, because we are now about 4 times as big as we were, and that additional growth has happened in areas not covered by either redlining or by covenants. Nevertheless, the areas that had covenants were rated higher, and the areas that are joining those areas are also show the same sorts of exclusive tendencies for the most part. The first racial covenant in the US was used in 1843, and it was directed at African Americans, called Negroes in the covenant, and people from the island of Ireland. So if you were Irish or African American, you were excluded from Linden Hills in Brookline, Massachusetts. First one in Minnesota was in Minneapolis, as far as we know, in 1910. And the first one, as far as we've been able to find so far, in Rochester was in 1916. They became increasingly popular after 1917 because the Supreme Court ruled that race-based municipal zoning, where you would say by a zoning ordinance, only white people can live in this area, was in violation of the 14th Amendment. Because the racial covenant is a private agreement, part of a property transaction, the Supreme Court treated them differently and ruled that they were enforceable in 1926. as a result of an NAACP series of lawsuits that started in 1926 and finally succeeded in 1948, the Supreme Court changed its position on this, kind of the same thing as they did with the Plessy versus Ferguson issue, and ruled them unenforceable in 1948. First state to make them illegal was Massachusetts, ironically, and that was in 1946. Minnesota followed suit in 1953, and then they were made illegal in 1968. The geographic logic of racial covenants is important because that same logic applies to any other kind of covenant, basically. Well, most other kinds of covenants. You would think that limiting the pool of potential buyers would be counterproductive unless there's some enhanced value to the neighborhood. And the logic of enhanced value depends on a market that values racial exclusion. In other words, a racist market. And similarly, anything that values exclusion of particular classes or particular income ranges has to be a classist market. So far, we have not found any isolated racial covenants. There could be other kind of covenants like this area, this yard has to be maintained as prairie. That wouldn't depend on the same geographic logic. Here's an example of a racial covenant at the time of subdivision. It's in Cascade Manor, which is part of Kutzke Park neighborhood, immediately south of Kutzke Park. And there's the deed for a property, and here's the covenant that shows up on multiple properties. And here's what it says. I'll let you read it. I point out that any African blood or descent is a common phrase here, and at the time, the authors of these covenants didn't realize that all human beings are of African blood or descent. But did they only know? Had they only known, they would have excluded everybody but space aliens, of course. It's interesting because we had such a small number of anybody other than white majority people that they were excluding Chinese, Japanese, Moorish. You wonder how many Moorish people were threatening to live in this area of Kutzke Park, or Turks. But there you have it. These are the three subdivisions that had covenants in any city besides Rochester, and that was at the time in the township of Orinoco. It's now in the city of Orinoco, and these are the similar language. I point out that Oak Ridge is where Harry Harwick had a second home along Lake Shady. A number of our areas were covered by racial covenants after the time of subdivision. So this is sort of a more laborious process, but here's a subdivision called Belmont Addition up on south of 7th Street Southwest, along 12th Avenue and 13th Avenue. And so it was planted in 1913, and in 1929 they imposed a covenant. And that one says similar stuff. They've left out Turkish and Moorish, taking a chance, I guess. And note that they say if you're a bona fide servant employed by a resident, you're good to go. That subdivision was an interesting situation in that there are actually so far we've discovered 5 covenants that applied to that area, that neighborhood. 2 of them were superseded by the one I just showed you. One of them was superseded, the one in yellow, by a whole new subdivision that had a subdivision imposed at the time of platting, and that was a 1930s or late 20s vintage plat. And two of them, the ones in white, are still on that deed. They're the only ones that apply to that deed. One of them says, said premises shall never be occupied by a colored person, or for any immoral use. Harry Harwick and William J. Mayo worked on a covenant in 1930 that covered over 90 properties. And that's the largest retroactive covenant that we've found so far. And again, they make allowance for bona fide servants employed by residents of a person living on the lot. So we've mapped where the covenants that we've found so far have applied. What we've worked on are the ones that were created mostly at the time of subdivision and between 1915 and 1955. So here are all of them for the Rochester area. That's Highway 52, Highway 14, and what was Highway 63 comes up through like that. That's the river and Bear Creek and Willow Creek and so on. I'll zoom in. This is the area south of Kuski Park, the actual park that I mentioned earlier. This is an area between 7th and 8th Avenue, north of 7th Street. This is an area just southwest of Indian Heights Park and southwest of that factory that's up there. And this is along Highway 52, west of 18th Avenue, north of Appliance Village. Where you see a globs of white in the middle of it, that's usually means that it's been re-subdivided. So a new subdivision plat has been developed that didn't have a racial covenant. The dates of these were just on the threshold of being declared unenforceable. And in Northeast Rochester, this area here is Jefferson School. And in 1948, the subdivision east of Jefferson School was platted with a racial covenant. This is 11th Avenue Northeast, and there's an area platted in 1929 that had a racial covenant. Here's our first one, 1916. These two blocks south of Center Street and east of 11th Avenue. And then in 1922, two additional areas east of 13th Avenue Southeast and south of Center Street. Further south, this is where Horace Mann School is, and this is 3rd Avenue, and there's this area in the middle. If you look closely, there's an area where we had retroactive racial covenants applied in two subdivisions where they abutted this area that had a racial covenant. This is an area along Marion Road, platted in 1940. And this is the area across from what used to be Golden Hill School. Used to be a hill there, a flat spot formerly housing Golden Hill School. That lot there is mostly Starbucks now. That's 20th Street, 3rd Avenue, and South Broadway. And finally, the Mother Lode. Southwest Rochester, that's 2nd Street, 6th Street, 8th Avenue, and 15th Avenue, Plummer Circle, and so on. The most recent one there was 1937, a retroactive covenant that covered some areas that had been somehow left out, I guess. Point out that the orange or gold areas are not necessarily areas that don't have covenants. They were just did not have covenants at the time of subdivision. And so in our next phase, we'll be looking at more of these that abut, especially those that abut areas that have racial covenants. And we'll also be looking at these green areas. These are platted before 1915 and may well have covenants that were applied retroactively. And here we are up in Orinoco Township. These were in the late 30s, early 40s in what's now the city of Orinoco around Lake Shady. And these are in the 40s along Lake Zumbro. And it's interesting that none of the ones along Lake Zumbro have covenants at the time of platting. And because they're platted in the 40s, it's almost certain they never have had covenants. And all these along Lake Shady had covenants, and they are 38, 39, and 40. Oak Ridge, Alice Point, and Wirt Grove, I'm sure you want to know. So far, we have found 1,022 lots that have covenants. We still have 7,860 lots conceivably that we would have to look at, but we're probably not going to look at all of those. We verified that 2,713 have no covenant. So about a third of the lots, a little under, about a third of the lots that we can absolutely be certain of have covenants. So there are the.
Phil,
Go ahead.
before we move to phase two, I see Jim has a question. Would you be able to take that question on this first phase?
Is it on the chat?
Yeah. Well, he's got his hand raised. So.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Jim.
Phil, I have a question. The area north of Appliance Village, that's really called, I think, Northgate First Edition, and that seems like it's pretty recent. I was kind of concerned. Well, I'm not concerned. Just wondered what that, when that was platted.
That's actually the area that I've mapped there is Allendale.
Oh, it's up in Allendale.
Yeah.
It didn't look like it was that far away. I'm sorry. Yeah, Allendale was probably before Northgate. You're right. Got it.
Yep.
Not a
Yeah, it was
problem.
1946, I think.
Yep, got it.
Okay. Let me see who's got a question on the chat. I'm not going to be able to look at the chat, I guess. Is there anything on that?
That's just a comment about the one of those deeds that you had also showed that you couldn't build a house for less than tied in with it, which also was going to be sure you got the right kind of people.
Right. So our next phase is to look at the lots that are close to and within 100 feet of a lot with a covenant, and that's based on the geographic logic that you have to have a neighborhood that in order to be thoroughly exclusive. You could have a mansion in the middle of a slum, but it's not the same as having a mansion in the middle of a set of mansions, apparently. Same thing applies to white-only neighborhoods. A white-only house is fairly easy to establish. A white-only neighborhood takes a little more work. So process is, and I mention this because I'm sure there'll be people on the call here who want to volunteer. You'll get a list of lots and you'll check them for racial covenants. And if you find them, you'll record them and list all of the affected parcels. And it takes more work to verify the absence of a covenant than to verify the presence of a covenant, but you'll have to do that too. And then we'll look for a smaller sample of lots in more distant locations, such as the earlier subdivisions that are nowhere close to other subdivisions. So for example, some of those green areas could have relatively isolated covenants, just like those areas in southeast Rochester. So here are all the volunteers who've worked on it so far. And we've all worked diligently. Some of them have done multiple sets of plats. I also want to thank Olmsted County Property Records and Licensing because the access that they've provided to us for free, if we were to have paid for it at the rate that they charge most people, private, people doing this for gain, basically. We're up in the thousands of dollars. So thanks to them. So back on why we care, the continuing impact relates to a Roberts Court distinction maintaining that desegregation strategies can only be constitutional when applied to remedy the effects of past legal segregation. That was in a case that involved cases that involved Seattle and Louisville, Kentucky. But since covenants were enforced through the courts by civil lawsuit, and since redlining was a policy of the Federal Housing Administration, there's nothing about this that's de facto. It's all been deliberate. And the result of segregation of this nature is a significant wealth gap between white and minority households. And that wealth gap is generational. It limits opportunity in multiple ways. Home ownership is where a whole lot of households have most of their wealth stored. And so when they pass on that wealth, they have some. But if you have been unable to own a house, you have no wealth to pass on. All you pass on is a history of having paid rent. And that means, first of all, home ownership is much lower among minorities, even after adjusting for income. It's dramatically lower, even here in Olmsted County. And college debt is some 2 or 3 times higher on average among minority students than among white students, especially African-American students. When you have neighborhoods that are exclusive based on income, for example, because that wealth gap has created a gap in the ability to pay higher prices for housing. A wealth gap based on class maintains racial and ethnic segregation. So immigrants, lower income immigrants and ethnic groups and racial groups affected by the wealth gap are excluded from neighborhoods that have high-priced restrictions on them. And that ends up, of course, segregating our schools also. If you want to volunteer for the mapping aspect of this, be happy to train you how to do this. And my email address is there. And if you want to volunteer, if you're a pro bono attorney especially, and you want to volunteer for discharging covenants, contact the city attorney's office at justdeeds@rochestermin.gov. And that's the main part of what I showed to the NAACP session last Saturday. But here's the next aspect of this that Helen asked me to look into, and that's ongoing kind of covenant and other types of deals that affect the price of housing. So this map, or this chart, shows the average size of lots in the city of Rochester, subdivided after 2010. The minimum lot size in 2010 was 6,000 square feet. And there were 8 to 18 that might have been close to that. 98% of the lots were on the order of 50% larger than the minimum lot size. The plurality of lots were twice as big. That's the 12,000 square foot lot. The reason lot size makes a difference is because a whole lot of the costs of development are fixed costs. So if you have to extend water, sewer, and roads to and electrical systems and so on to a neighborhood, then it's 100 acres. If you get what would it be, 500 houses in that 100 acres, then that cost is divided among a lot more houses than if you get 100, right? So planting smaller lots helps develop more affordable housing. So that's one aspect of it, because developers have been planting larger and larger lots. Um, Covenants can include restrictions on building size, and that adds to the cost of housing. Here's an example from an area in northeast Rochester that has minimum floor areas for several different sizes of house, types, styles of house it is. Here's a subdivision platted in 1980 that sets a minimum price, and that minimum price is $125,000. At the time, that was 3 times the average cost of single-family homes in Rochester. And so that would put it, if it were today, it would be up around $600,000, $700,000. So in other words, again, I'm guaranteeing that it's not going to be affordable housing for sure. And here's one with restrictions on materials. So it says, if 2 sides of a building are stone, then all 4 sides of the buildings must be in stone. Fences have to be, I thought, identical siding materials as the home. I thought that was a remarkable thing. If you're going to put up, I think one way to avoid that cost is simply not put up a fence. But anyway, this is an area that has an average lot size of over 1 acre. And this is again in Rochester with water and sewer. And so you are ending up with restrictions, basically lot price as well as building materials. Those are the 3 examples I had that Helen asked me to provide. And I think that's what I got from my presentation. Yes. So I'll stop sharing and be able for questions if you have any.
Yes. So yes, are there any questions for Phil at this point in the presentation? April, are you, I think I saw you went off of mute. Did you have a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm wondering the new zoning plan that the city has, does it affect lot size and all this other stuff that Phil's been sharing?
Okay, there's a little bit of feedback, but I think that but the question is, I think the distinct is zoning compared to these covenants and how that those interrelate. Is that
well, the new zoning that is being proposed in the city?
yeah? Okay. So Phil, and I believe that's the UDC that you're talking about.
So she's talking about the new zoning ordinance that the city is proposing.
Right.
So that's not the uniform building code. That's the city's own ordinance. And,
right. Okay.
Yep. I'm not an expert on the new city zoning ordinance because I've been retired for since 2013, almost for 9 years now. So
Right.
it'd be a good idea to consult with the city staff about that. But again, I'd point out that even with the old ordinance, subdividers were serving a market that was not influenced by the minimum lot size that the city imposed. I think, from my time in planning, much of the cost of a new lot had to do with the what's called the sewer availability charge, the water availability charge, and so on. And those are fixed costs. We have a choice. We either charge new owners for those costs, or we charge existing owners for the cost of new development. And since most new development historically has been more expensive than old development, so if you live in a house built in 1890, it's unlikely to cost very much, right? So a whole lot of owner-occupied housing happens in the used housing market. So taking some of those charges off new development would actually impose it on the people who are living in older housing. There might be a brilliant solution to this dilemma, but the city hasn't hit on it yet, as far as I know.
Jim, you had your hand up. Did you have a question or a comment?
No, I make a comment for April. April, I don't think that's been determined yet, and I think that's the land use manual that is under discussion with the city. I did have a conversation with one city council person the other day, and his reaction was, I hope that it will have zero. We will have no minimum lot size. We will have no minimum front side or rear yard setbacks. You can build right up to the property line if you want. So that would take all of the zoning away. But I think, Phil, I think we should determine, or we should let people know that the covenants usually are by the developer that have nothing to do with the city. Now, the question really is, can the city council override a developer's covenants that the developer says, well, I want a size or whatever it happens to be. Can the city override that? And I don't know that answer, Phil.
Well, the city could set a maximum lot size, for example. And the
Let's
city
not-
could,
Yeah, let's not talk about just maximum lot size. Let's talk about a whole lot of other things. Let's
Yeah,
talk
well,
about the size of the house and garages attached or detached or fences or whatever it happens to be. If the developer brought a project to the city council for final plat of review or whatever step it is, could the city council say, we don't like these covenants and we're going to ask you to go back and review them?
I'm not sure of this, but the city does have the ability to approve or deny a plat, and they have to do it based on some sort of standard. So they would have to amend their ordinance to address that standard. One thing that some jurisdictions have done, such as Montgomery County, Maryland, has said, if you're going to have a development, then part of your development has to provide for affordable housing. And that's true of all developments in Montgomery County. And you either have to do it by if your development is small enough and terrain is difficult enough, you can do it by paying into a fund for affordable housing. But if it's a large enough area, you have to have affordable housing in it. It's been tried in various parts of the country and different levels of success. There's a city in Colorado that did it, and what happened was nearly all of the development happened outside the city limits. And that's one of the issues with Rochester also, is the fear that if the city gets adopts regulations that require affordable housing and townships do not, then all of the high value housing will go to the townships, and the city will take a tax hit, basically. But the problem fundamentally is, if we have a classist market, then the developer wants to build for that market. Not all developers, but lots of them will. But inclusionary zoning is one strategy that has been tried and has been successful, where applied at a broad enough area that the spillover market things are controlled.
Right. The city about 4 or 5 years ago did spend some money and had a person come in, a consultant come in and do a report on inclusionary zoning. But the report was positive in saying, we should and could try it here, but it kind of was put on the shelf and has not gone anywhere. But yeah, that has been looked at here, but nothing was done on it. Now, one of the things, and Jim, I don't know if you can share, if you've got that PDF that we can share. We did have found one covenant set of covenants for another development besides the ones that Phil had, and those are very helpful, Phil. And I know one of the things in that I did notice, it said that if there's a difference between the city and the developer's restrictions, the more restrictive will apply. Okay. So in other words, the city may say, okay, you can't have a minimum square footage of the house, for example. But if the developer says that it has to be restricted to larger homes, according to the covenants, the way it's written, the developer could still have that. And now, then again, how does that play out? And how would it go to court if a developer wanted to, let's say, require 3,000 square foot minimum houses, and the city had said that we don't have those regulations. But that's one of the covenants that is in that particular development. And so that could, if it came to it, would that have to go to court? And we talked about this a little bit, Jim and I talked about this a little earlier today too. How many, and I know the group that we have on these calls, people are more aware of things related to real estate perhaps than most. But the last time you bought a house, if you are a homeowner in this group, did you really pay much attention to any covenants that might apply? Do you know what kind of covenants might be on your property? I know I've lived in 6 states. I've looked at and bought and sold property in different states. And I know that has rarely been on my radar. And so are these covenants out there that many of us aren't paying any attention to, but could still be impacting affordability? It's just a question, that's, and then, okay, so April says, what causes covenants to expire? In her neighborhood, they're sunsetted after X number of years. And I know, again, the one covenant I was looking at, I believe it was a 20 or 30 year, I don't have it right in front of me, but but then it's automatically renewed every 10 years unless people step forward not to. So it's good to know, April, that yours are expiring. Your XX, do you know approximately how long that is?
Most of them are 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
In fact, I think 30 years is the standard. And as you say, many covenants provide for extending them.
Right.
So.
Yeah. The one that I was looking at, it's extended unless people come forward and say that, that unless the people in the development don't want to.
We did see a racial covenant where everything else but the race